Now, I would like to look at intercultural communication as communication. And my thesis here is that intercultural communication is communication par excellence. What does it mean? It means that studying its instances, we see the various features, various characteristics, variables, and parameters of communication in general, more vividly. That in intercultural communications, certain things are really lit, are really in the focus. Why, you may say that? Because in any type of communication, making sense depends on common meanings. When we understand each other, when we construct meaning, listening to the words, phrases, to the sounds that get into our mind, what we want to do, we try to make sense. And this is based on some common ideas, on some broad knowledge, common meanings, or as we can call it, common frame of reference. But even more so, even more important it is in communication between people from different cultures, because their frames of reference may be differing. They may not overlap, or even overlapping, they may not coincide. And this is where we see these breakdowns of communication, as I said, really vividly, something that throws light on certain aspects of communication in general. That's why I think it is communication par excellence. How it works when we communicate across the cultural borders. What can be different in these frames of reference? For instance, our understanding of what is good and bad. But even more simple things, if I say, even in a general communication, not across the borders, I say, let's have a lunch, and you say, well, great idea. Are we both sure, even if we're talking to our close friend, that what I meant by lunch and what you meant by lunch are the same things? I may have an idea of a salad, you may have an idea of a sandwich, or a soup, or whatever. So even such simple, very specific, very concrete things between two people who actually know each other, because otherwise I wouldn't say, why don't we have lunch together? Even in such situations, we may have not exactly the same frame of reference for the very simple and concrete word, lunch. And if we talk about such ideas as good and bad, for instance, I say, oh, he really did it well, or he's a good guy. What I understand by good guy and what you understand by good guy. And if I come from one culture and you come from another, and our ideas of what is really good and bad may not coincide. So there we may potentially see some breakdowns in communication that can probably lead to some consequences or maybe not. But it's always interesting to understand what other people, those who study, those others, in this case Russians, what they understand as good and bad. What it means to be efficient. What is the meaning of this word? Not the one that you put in the dictionary, but what it really means in life. What does it mean to be efficient in Russia? What does it mean to be efficient in France, in the United States, in Saudi Arabia? How to address people, how to praise them. Again, we think this is simple, but our idea of polite behavior is very different in different cultures. Even more simple, more technical things will mean in communication. For instance, what does falling intonation mean? In Russian, it's very different from English, for instance. And sometimes people who speak some Russian, who know Russian, but they don't feel what this culturally, they're not used to this falling intonation. For them, it sounds like a very rude, very abrupt utterance, though Russians who would hear the same phrase would say, no, no, she wasn't rude. So it's about such technical thing as falling intonation, or a smile, famous American smile. Do we understand what we talk about when we say famous American smile or lack of the famous American smile in Russia? Actually, these are all linguistic notions. They are not about specifically cultural issues. They are about how we interpret meanings and utterances with both verbal and non-verbal signals coming to us. But they are important, and they tell us the importance of this cultural knowledge that preempts and that supports communication. Now, let's talk about context. Context is a very important concept in intercultural communication and in communication in general. And as I said, intercultural communication in a way is a litmus paper. We can see certain things really more vividly, with more distinction. And this is true also for the importance of context in communication. Communication takes place in an enormous variety of contexts for interaction. It can be physical context, like the room in which we talk, or an auditorium for a public lecture, or it is relations between psychological context, which is relations between the participants, social context, political context, whatever. But also in terms of concepts that are more relevant for the process of communication per se, we can talk about speech situations or discourse genres. Discourse genres like giving a lecture, making a presentation, or participating in a friendly conversation at the dinner table, or singing a lullaby to your baby at the bedtime. All of these are specific discourse genres. All of them have their rules and their formats and their mechanisms for performing them. And of course, all of them are influenced by culture, by what is used, how it is used to be done in where you live, where you are. And at the same time, contexts are important in intercultural communication because such generalizations, or call it stereotypes, or call it just concepts as American smile or Russian emotionality, are meaningless unless we point out in which context they use, what meaning they have for this a certain situation, how we understand Russian emotionality, and why actually British specialists will call certain things that Russians don't see as emotional, where it comes from, and in what situation it can be. So we need to describe contexts. They are potentially countable. There are many of them. We won't be able to count all and have a list or a table, but this is what we need to strive when we research or study intercultural communication, to be able to discriminate between various situations that create contexts and various rules that describe them, because this will make our generalizations about how Russians, French, Americans, or whoever behave and how they relate to smile or lack of smile, or being emotional or not being emotional in specific situations. A combination of contexts and rules stipulating them may be called formats, and that is how it's called in the scholarship on communication. They are called formats of communication, or in our case, formats of intercultural communication. So what I want to, how I would like to wrap this piece is that culturally framed utterances and interactions take place and can only be described within certain formats. Otherwise, it will be like trying to put a person not in a real life, but on a blank screen or on a piece of paper where you don't see any borders, any boundaries for your actions. About intercultural communication formats, before we describe them, and these are kind of well-established concepts, we need to say that intercultural communication can take place in both narrow and broad sense. This is the understanding of it. Intercultural communication in narrow sense is actually this prototypical situation of individuals interacting with each other, individuals that belong to various cultural paradigms and that try to achieve certain success in their communication here and now. When we talk about intercultural communication in broad sense, we actually bring together everything that is related to the interaction of cultures in any meaning of this word. For instance, when I read a novel written by a person living in another time, and a novel that was written in another language, say Charles Dickens' novel, it is also a process of intercultural communication, because I have to interpret the words, the phrases, the sentences of this book and make sense of it using my knowledge, my cultural ideas about certain things that we discussed. and tried to understand what was meant by the author. This is probably the broadest understanding of intercultural communication that involves not just translation of a book or a text, but the way you read this translation and try to make sense of what was put into these words on paper by a person belonging to another time, another space. The most important, mostly the most demanded formats of intercultural communication or visible formats are politics, business, mass media. That's where in the global world we really see the clash of different cultural presumptions, different frames of reference, and the ways these frames of reference are brought onto the surface of communicative events. And again, these events may take place in terms of oral communication, mass communication, written communication, so on and so forth. Another dimension, another type of formats will be professional, service, or social intercultural communications. Professional communication, we mean here communication that takes place between people who are united by certain profession, not necessarily journalism, law, or business, but it may be any profession like academic research, teaching, or some project managed by people from different culture. They have to communicate within their professional field, but they may have different cultural background. Service communication is a typical form when we see intercultural communication in our world, when representatives of one culture perform certain professions that service us in restaurants, in the streets, in the doctor's office, when an immigrant from some Asian country comes to social services building in the Western European countries. Again, we have an instance of service communication taking place between representatives of different cultures. And then social intercultural communication, something that happens in our global world very often. When people travel and they talk with each other in trains and buses, they want to find out how to get here and there. They do couch surfing, they communicate via Facebook or whatever. Again, different cultural backgrounds, though united by certain topic or space, virtual space, that brings them together, and they bring into this space their different cultural backgrounds. Which brings us to the idea that intercultural communication is not just knowledge, it's not just about knowledge, but also skills, because it's not enough to know something about other culture. It's the practice of communication, it's the skills of being culturally sensitive, of being capable of having cultural dialogue coming across the borders. That's what makes people efficient in their intercultural communication. So cultural skills, not just knowledge. And also what is important for studying intercultural communication and for teaching it is that we need to bring in some experiential activities. For instance, simulation games and personal stories. Because as I said, narratives and stories are the best narratives we have. They not only relate information to the addressee, to the audience, they also allow to express certain attitudes to the information that you provide. And culture is about attitudes. So stories, narratives are very important when we discuss issues that have some cultural meaning to them, when we try to understand Russians or French, or our old neighbor, or young people who are being born with the iPads in their hands. All this is an ability to relate your attitude towards the world. And to put it in some terminological borders, I would like to introduce the concept of discourse community. Because discourse community for linguists is what culture is for cultural anthropologists and for other people. We don't talk about culture in general, art, architecture, economy. We talk about culture in communication, and because of that, discourse community is a much more convenient and comfortable and comprehensive term. And now probably we can approach to the definition of intercultural communication. Of course, this course is not about definitions, but Sometimes definitions would be summarizing and reflecting what we decide, will reflect our perspective. They will show up what we decided upon, how we come to talk about this issue. So one very famous book that I use, Samovar and Porter, who started their publications in 1973. The following definition is based on the ideas expressed in this book. By intercultural communication, we understand a type of communication where success or failure of the encounters significantly depend on how culturally similar or culturally distant are the participants of this communicative event. So this is the idea. We don't describe intercultural communication as this, or that. We speak about the degree, of the sufficiency, the success. Or we can put it differently, that it's the communication where success or failure depend on whether the participants of this communicative event belong to the same discourse community. So that's why we need this term of discourse community. Communication within the discourse community or communication across the borders of this discourse community. The latter will be intercultural communication.